To my family, I was the reliable one, not the favorite, not the problem, just the one who showed up, remembered birthdays, handled logistics, filled in gaps. I was the person you asked to proofread a document, watch the kids for an hour, and drive someone to the airport at dawn. Useful, calm, easily overlooked. At family gatherings, I occupied a specific kind of space, the chair at the edge of the table, close enough to participate, far enough not to interrupt the rhythm that had already been set long before I was old enough to challenge it. Conversations moved around me, not through me. When I spoke, people nodded politely, then continued as if I'd added a footnote rather than a thought. No one was cruel about it. That's important. There were no raised voices, no insults. What existed instead was something more subtle, a collective agreement about who I was, or maybe who I wasn't. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't confrontational. I wasn't the one who needed attention. Over time, that became permission for interruptions, for decisions made without me, for jokes that landed just slightly at my expense and were brushed off as harmless because I didn't react. And because I didn't react, the assumption hardened. Blair doesn't mind. My father reinforced this without ever saying it outright. He was charismatic in a way that filled rooms, the kind of man whose confidence made people lean in, even when they weren't sure they agreed. He spoke in conclusions, not questions. When he told a story, it came pre-framed with the moral he wanted you to take from it. I learned early that disagreement with him required stamina, not because he yelled, but because he dismissed. A raised eyebrow, a sigh, "you're being sensitive." Over time, those responses trained everyone around him to conserve energy. It was easier to let him narrate reality than to challenge the way he edited it. So I didn't challenge it, not publicly, not emotionally. I learned something else instead: observation. I noticed how people behaved when they thought no one was tracking the details. I noticed how stories changed slightly depending on the audience. I noticed how certainty could be used as camouflage. At work, this made me good at what I did. At home, it made me invisible in a very specific way. I was present, but never central. Trusted, but rarely consulted. Praised for being easy, which I eventually understood meant non-disruptive. There's a particular loneliness in that role. Not the loneliness of exclusion, but the loneliness of being misread. When people assume you lack depth because you don't demand space, they stop offering it. I told myself I preferred it that way, that I valued peace, that I didn't need validation. And some of that was true, but some of it was habit. A posture I'd adopted so long ago it felt like part of my spine. By the time I was in my 30s, the role was fixed. At family dinners, I cleared plates while conversations continued. I remembered who didn't like onions, who needed gluten-free, and who was avoiding alcohol. I absorbed side comments and passing remarks like background noise. No one thought of me as someone who would keep score, or remember exact phrasing, or understand the implications of what was being said. That assumption that I was passive, unthreatening, uninterested in power was the most consistent thing about how they saw me, and I let it stand, because there's a difference between being underestimated and being unaware. I knew exactly who I was to them. I knew the limits of that perception. And I knew, even then, that if something ever crossed a line, if something mattered enough, the distance they placed between me and significance would become their blind spot. At the time, I didn't know what form that moment would take. I just knew that roles only protect people as long as nothing tests them. When that test came, it didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with urgency or drama. It came disguised as familiarity, as a casual sentence spoken over dinner by someone who assumed the room would treat it the way it always had, as if I wasn't really listening. The first small cut didn't register as a wound at the time. That's how these things usually happen. It came wrapped in normalcy, disguised as conversation, softened by context. If you were looking for something dramatic, you would have missed it entirely. It was a Sunday dinner, nothing ceremonial, just family, plates passed hand to hand, the low hum of a routine we'd repeated for years. My father was in a reflective mood, relaxed, almost generous with his words. He'd had a drink, maybe two. Enough to loosen the careful edges, not enough for anyone to think they needed to remember what he said later. We were talking about an old situation, something from years back that had caused tension at the time, but had since been filed away under resolved, or at least unspoken. Someone asked a question casually, the way people do when they believe enough time has passed to make curiosity safe. My father answered without hesitation. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't look around to check who was listening. He said it plainly, almost academically, like he was offering context, not confession. A sentence delivered with the confidence of someone who believes their interpretation is the final one. What he admitted wasn't shocking in the way movies teach us to expect. There was no gasp, no dropped fork. It was worse than that. It was specific. It filled in gaps I hadn't known how to name before. It confirmed something I'd suspected but never had language for. He acknowledged a choice he'd made, a deliberate one. He framed it as necessary, as unavoidable, as something any reasonable person in his position would have done. There was a pause after he spoke. Not long, just enough for the sentence to land and then be gently smoothed over. Someone laughed lightly. Someone else changed the subject. Plates were passed again. The moment was absorbed into the evening as if it had never existed. Everyone else seemed relieved to let it disappear. I wasn't. I remember exactly how my body reacted, not with anger, but with a kind of internal stillness. The way everything goes quiet when you realize you're holding something important. I didn't speak. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't look at him in a way that would signal anything had shifted. I just listened. I replayed the sentence in my head over and over, the phrasing, the verb he chose, the absence of regret, the assumption that explanation equaled absolution. I noted who was present, where everyone was seated, the order of the conversation before and after. Not because I intended to use it, because something in me understood that this was a hinge moment. One of those small, almost invisible turns where the future quietly changes direction. Later that night, after the dishes were done and people had started to leave, I stood alone in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary. I watched my father laugh with someone near the door, his version of the story already settling into something lighter, less precise. I realized then that what I had heard was not meant for scrutiny. It was meant for acceptance. He believed the room would hold it the way it had always held him, with trust, with deference, with the benefit of the doubt. And it did. Except for me. I didn't confront him. I didn't challenge the narrative. I didn't even tell anyone what I was thinking. On the surface, nothing had changed. But internally, a line had been crossed. Not because of the act he described, but because of how easily it was offered. How casually responsibility was reframed as inevitability. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to dismiss. But once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. And once you notice that the truth can be spoken openly and still be ignored, you start paying attention to what else might be hiding in plain sight. From that point on, I listened differently, not with suspicion, just with clarity. I stopped assuming that silence meant innocence, or that confidence meant accuracy. I stopped believing that time alone transformed actions into something safer. The rest of the family moved on. They always did. I didn't move on. I filed it away, not emotionally, but mentally, as a data point, as a marker, as the first moment I understood that what was said out loud could still be denied later, if no one insisted on remembering it. And I knew, without yet knowing why, that remembering would matter. After that dinner, nothing changed on the surface. That was the most unsettling part. No tension, no awkwardness, no follow-up conversations. The family narrative absorbed my father's admission the same way it absorbed everything else, by smoothing it down until it fit comfortably inside the version of him everyone preferred to believe. And because nothing changed, the quiet dismissals resumed, almost on schedule. They came in small, familiar forms. My input was acknowledged, then overridden. My concerns were met with patience instead of engagement. When I raised questions, they were treated as theoretical, interesting, but not urgent. When I didn't raise them, my silence was interpreted as agreement. It was never framed as disrespect. That would have required intention. Instead, it lived in assumptions, that I didn't need to be consulted, that I was fine either way, that I wasn't personally affected by decisions because I wasn't visibly reactive. I normalized it because everyone else did. When my father retold old stories, the details shifted slightly. The emphasis moved. Responsibility diffused. Sometimes I caught the change mid-sentence. A word swapped. A motive softened. When I noticed, I felt a small internal resistance, like a muscle tightening. But I didn't correct him. I told myself it wasn't worth it. That memory is subjective. That families survive by allowing some elasticity in their stories. I told myself that being right wasn't the same as being at peace. What I didn't tell myself was how often this elasticity always bent in one direction. If someone else misremembered something, my father corrected them. Gently, but definitively. If I remembered something differently, it was framed as perspective, or sensitivity, or confusion. Maybe that's how it felt to you, he'd say. It was a sentence that sounded generous and landed like erasure. Over time, I learned to pre-edit myself, to soften statements before they were spoken, to add disclaimers. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm remembering this incorrectly, so the room would stay comfortable. And because I was careful, because I didn't escalate, the pattern continued unchallenged. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from constantly managing how much truth a room can tolerate. You start prioritizing harmony over accuracy, not because you're afraid of conflict, but because you don't believe the conflict would change anything. I wasn't afraid of my father. I was tired of the choreography. I also noticed something else. The way people deferred to him even when they disagreed. The way his confidence created a gravitational pull. The way others adjusted their recollections mid-conversation to align with his. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient. And I was complicit. Every time I stayed quiet, I reinforced the idea that his version was the stable one. Every time I chose calm over correction, I helped normalize a hierarchy where certain voices carried weight, and others existed mainly to support the structure. I rationalized this by telling myself I didn't need to be seen as powerful. That influence wasn't my goal. That my values were internal, not performative. Some of that was still true, but another part of me, the part that remembered that dinner, that specific sentence, was quietly keeping track of how often truth became flexible when it was inconvenient. The disrespect wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It lived in interruptions, in jokes that landed just a second too long, in decisions made for everyone that somehow never included me in the process. And because it was normalized, it became invisible, even to me at times. I'd leave gatherings feeling vaguely unsettled, unable to point to a single moment that justified the feeling. I'd replay conversations later and realize how much I'd edited myself in real time, how much I'd absorbed without comment. I told myself this was adulthood, that this was what mature relationships look like, that choosing your battles meant letting small things go. But small things accumulate, and normalization is powerful. It teaches you what to expect, and more importantly, what not to ask for. By the time I realized how deeply this pattern had set in, it felt less like something being done to me and more like something I was participating in. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Because once you see how disrespect can exist without cruelty, how dismissal can masquerade as patience, you stop waiting for a dramatic signal that something is wrong. You start noticing the systems, the roles, the unspoken agreements, and you start asking yourself a quieter, more dangerous question. What happens if this dynamic ever matters in a context where the stakes are real? And silence isn't just uncomfortable, but consequential. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that I hadn't just fallen into a role. I'd been assigned one. Not through conversation or agreement, but through repetition. Through what people learned they could expect from me, and what they learned they didn't need to worry about. I was the stabilizer. Every family system has one. The person who absorbs tension so it doesn't spread. The one who doesn't escalate, who smooths transitions, who makes it easier for everyone else to stay the way they are. The reliable presence that keeps things functioning without demanding acknowledgement. At first it feels like trust. People come to you with their problems. They vent. They ask for help. They lean on your steadiness. And because you're capable, because you care, you respond. You show up. You fix what can be fixed. You listen without judgment. But slowly the role hardens. You're no longer someone with needs of your own. You're infrastructure. When something goes wrong, you're expected to handle it. When something is decided, you're informed after the fact. When something is uncomfortable, you're expected to understand why now isn't the right time to bring it up. I saw this most clearly in how my father interacted with me versus how he interacted with others. With them, he explained. With me, he concluded. If I asked a question, it was treated as curiosity, not input. If I offered a different perspective, it was acknowledged politely and then set aside. He trusted me to cope, not to influence. And because I did cope, quietly, competently, that trust was reinforced. There's a strange paradox in being seen as emotionally strong. People assume that strength means self-sufficiency, that you don't need room because you make room for yourself, that you don't need protection because you can endure. So I endured. I didn't argue when plans were made without my availability in mind. I didn't push back when my contributions were treated as expected rather than appreciated. I didn't insist on clarity when ambiguity benefited someone else, not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed my restraint was part of my integrity. What I didn't realize yet was that integrity without boundaries becomes permission. The role I was assigned required consistency, reliability, predictability. I was expected to remain calm regardless of context, to be reasonable regardless of provocation, to prioritize the system over my own experience. And as long as I stayed within that role, I was valued. The moment I imagined stepping outside it, even internally, I felt the weight of potential disruption. I could already hear the responses. That's not like you. You're overthinking. Why make a big deal out of this now? Those phrases are powerful deterrents. They don't accuse you of being wrong. They accuse you of being different. So I stayed where I was. But something subtle had shifted since that dinner. The role no longer felt neutral. It felt strategic. On their part, not mine. A way of keeping the system intact by placing emotional labor where it would never challenge authority. I began to see how often my calmness was used as evidence that everything was fine. How my silence was cited as consensus. How my flexibility made rigidity elsewhere possible. And I started to understand something uncomfortable. The role I played protected others from accountability. As long as I remained the stabilizer, no one had to slow down. No one had to examine inconsistencies. No one had to reconcile private admissions with public narratives. I wasn't just invisible. I was useful. That realization didn't make me want to explode or confront anyone. It did something quieter and far more permanent. It made me stop performing the role unconsciously. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become cold. I simply began to observe myself the way I'd been observing everyone else. When did I step in automatically? When did I smooth things over without being asked? When did I absorb discomfort that wasn't mine to carry? And most importantly, what would happen if I didn't? I didn't have answers yet, but for the first time I could see the role clearly enough to imagine not inhabiting it forever. And once you see a role for what it is, it stops being an identity and starts being a choice. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen in a moment of anger or revelation. No one said anything new. No truth was uncovered. In fact, the day itself was unremarkable. One of those days that only gained significance in hindsight. I was sitting alone in my car, parked outside my apartment, long after I'd turned off the engine. I had just come from another family gathering. Another evening of listening, nodding, adjusting. Another round of quiet accommodations left me feeling slightly misaligned with myself. I wasn't upset. That's what stood out. There was no heat in my chest, no urge to replay conversations, just a steady, neutral awareness that something wasn't working anymore. I thought about that dinner months earlier, the one where my father had spoken too freely. I thought about how easily the moment had been absorbed, how quickly the narrative had reset. I thought about how little effort it had taken for the truth to disappear, and how much effort it would take to bring it back. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether I should. Instead, I asked what it would cost not to. That question landed differently. I realized that every time I stayed quiet to preserve peace, I was paying a small internal price. Not in resentment, but in erosion, a gradual narrowing of what I allowed myself to acknowledge. A subtle training in self-minimization. I had told myself I was choosing calm. What I hadn't admitted was that I was choosing it even when it came at the expense of accuracy. Sitting there, keys still in my hand, I made a decision. Not an action, not a plan. just a decision about attention. I would stop letting things pass by default, not confronting, not correcting, not escalating, just noticing and remembering. I didn't announce this to anyone. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself at the time. But something in me recalibrated, like a lens snapping into focus. At the next interaction, I noticed how quickly I was expected to agree, how often my father spoke in summaries, not details. His version of events always positioned him as reasonable, reluctant, and justified. I noticed how often other people deferred, not because they were convinced, but because it was easier. And I noticed something else, how my silence was doing work for him. That realization was the shift. I stopped filling in gaps. If someone misunderstood something he'd said, I didn't clarify on his behalf. If an assumption was made that benefited him, I didn't reinforce it with a nod or a smile. I didn't challenge anything openly. I simply withdrew my automatic support. The effect was subtle but immediate. Conversations moved differently, not dramatically, but with small hesitations. Slight pauses where I used to smooth things over. No one commented on it, they just adjusted. And in those adjustments, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not empowerment, not vindication, relief. Relief at no longer carrying responsibility for maintaining a version of reality that didn't sit right with me. Relief at allowing silence to exist without rushing to make it comfortable. That day in the car, I also acknowledged something I'd avoided until then. If this situation ever moved beyond family dynamics, if it entered a formal space, a legal one, the difference between what was said privately and what would be said publicly would matter. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I knew enough to understand that memory wasn't enough. That intention wasn't enough. That quiet clarity needed structure if it was ever going to hold. So I began to prepare, not for confrontation, but for consistency. I wrote things down, dates, phrases, context. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. The way I did at work, the way I'd been trained to do. It didn't feel dramatic, it felt responsible. The shift wasn't about turning into someone else. It was about stopping the slow habit of disappearing. I was still calm, still composed, still quiet. But now, that quiet had direction. And direction, I was learning, changes everything. Once I stopped using silence as a reflex, it changed character. It was no longer something I defaulted to in order to keep the peace. It became something I chose, deliberately, based on context. That distinction matters. When silence is automatic, it drains you. When it's chosen, it conserves energy. I didn't announce this shift. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. I still listened more than I spoke. I still avoided unnecessary conflict. I still let conversations end without forcing resolution. But internally, I was no longer disengaged. I began to recognize patterns with sharper clarity. How certain topics were framed to invite agreement rather than discussion. How my father used certainty as a substitute for transparency. How would he state outcomes without walking anyone through the steps that led there? When I did speak, I chose my moments carefully. I asked neutral questions, clarifying ones, questions that required specificity, not defensiveness. How did that timeline work again? Who else was involved at that point? What happened after that conversation? I asked them in the same calm tone I used for everything else. Sometimes he answered smoothly. Sometimes he deflected. Sometimes he gave details that contradicted earlier versions. Small things, easy to miss if you weren't listening for consistency. I listened. I didn't react when I noticed discrepancies. I didn't point them out. I just noted them, mentally, and later on paper. This was the part no one saw. From the outside, my silence looked unchanged. If anything, people seemed to read it as increased compliance. The questions I asked were interpreted as curiosity, not scrutiny. My lack of emotional response reassured everyone that nothing was at stake. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. My father, especially, seemed relaxed around me. He spoke freely, assuming I wasn't tracking the implications. He didn't edit himself in my presence, the way he sometimes did with others, who challenged him more openly. There's a confidence people develop when they believe they're not being evaluated. I let him keep it. I also noticed how others responded to my quiet. They continued to assume that if something mattered to me, I would say so. That if something was wrong, I would make it visible. They underestimated how much information a calm presence can collect. I wasn't silent because I had nothing to say. I was silent because I was choosing when it would matter. During this time, I refined my notes. I didn't record impressions or emotions. I recorded facts, dates, direct quotes when I could remember them, who was present, how statements were framed. I treated it like a professional obligation, not a personal one. That boundary was important. It kept me from turning this into a grievance. It kept me from narrating myself as a victim. I wasn't gathering ammunition, I was preserving accuracy. And accuracy, I was learning, is a form of power that doesn't announce itself. There were moments when I was tempted to speak, to correct a misstatement, to challenge a rewrite in real time. Each time I asked myself the same question: would this change anything right now? The answer was usually no. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid of rocking the boat, but because I was watching where the boat was headed. Silence also gave me something else: space. Space to notice my own reactions. Space to separate what I felt from what needed to be done. Space to decide how involved I wanted to be in preserving relationships that required my erasure. I wasn't strategizing in the way people imagine. There was no endgame yet, no dramatic reveal planned, just a growing certainty that if this ever moved into a formal arena, one that valued consistency and evidence over confidence, I would be ready. And until then, silence was not submission. It was positioning. I didn't know when the moment would come. I just knew that when it did, it wouldn't reward volume or outrage. It would reward precision. So I waited. And while I waited, everyone else assumed I wasn't paying attention at all. What they never noticed was how much time exists inside quiet. When you're not rushing to be heard, you have room to observe. When you're not defending yourself, you can track patterns. When you're not trying to win arguments, you can understand systems. I had always been observant, but now observation had intention. I began to see the family dynamic the way I saw processes at work. Not emotionally, but structurally. Who spoke first? Who summarized? Who corrected? Who deferred? I noticed how often my father positioned himself as the final authority without ever explicitly claiming it. He didn't need to. The system already supported him. People deferred because it was efficient. Because challenging him required energy and explanation. Because he spoke with enough confidence that disagreement felt like an interruption rather than a contribution. And because no one, including me for a long time, had insisted on precision. I started to notice how often his private language differed from his public one. In smaller settings, he spoke in admissions and rationalizations. He acknowledged gray areas. He framed choices as necessary compromises. He trusted that the context would soften the meaning. In larger or more formal settings, his language shifted. Sentences became cleaner. Responsibility diffused. Choices turned into inevitabilities. His role became reactive rather than active. It was subtle, plausible, almost elegant, and completely inconsistent. I noticed this because I wasn't engaging emotionally anymore. I wasn't waiting for him to validate my perspective. I wasn't hoping for acknowledgement. I was listening for continuity. I also noticed how easily other people filled in gaps on his behalf, how they interpreted his pauses generously, how they supplied motives that made his actions seem reasonable. He didn't always have to defend himself. The system did it for him. That's when I understood something critical. If this ever came down to credibility, it wouldn't be about who was louder or more convincing. It would be about who could remain consistent when the narrative was tested. Consistency requires memory. So I treated memory like an asset. I organized my notes by date. I cross-referenced conversations. I included context, not speculation, just circumstances. I didn't assume intent. I recorded phrasing. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was no reason to. From the outside, my behavior hadn't changed enough to invite curiosity. What also went unnoticed was how my silence affected access. People spoke more freely around me when they believed I wasn't evaluating them. My father especially seemed to relax. He used me as a sounding board. He tested explanations out loud. He shared frustrations about how things were being misinterpreted elsewhere. Each time I listened, not with judgment, with clarity. I also began to understand the limits of my role. The stabilizer is trusted but not feared, included but not deferred to. That position gave me proximity without scrutiny. I could see how narratives were constructed in real time, how events were reframed before they ever left the room, how small adjustments were made to protect the shape of a story, and I could see how fragile that shape was. All it took was a single inconsistency, introduced in the wrong setting, for the entire structure to wobble. I didn't feel satisfaction at that realization. I felt responsibility, because knowing how something works gives you a choice. Exploit it or handle it carefully. I chose carefully. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was over-analyzing, if I was attributing intention where there was only habit. Each time I went back to the same standard, accuracy. I wasn't building a case. I was preserving reality. Reality, unlike narratives, doesn't require agreement to exist. What they never noticed was that while they were moving comfortably within a familiar system, I was quietly stepping outside of it. Not emotionally, structurally. I wasn't withdrawing from the family. I wasn't distancing myself. I was simply no longer carrying the weight of keeping things aligned. That freed up an enormous amount of mental space. Enough space to see that what had been said at that dinner, the admission everyone else had let slide, was not an isolated moment. It was part of a larger pattern of private acknowledgement and public revision. And patterns, once documented, stopped being deniable. I didn't know yet how or when this would surface. I only knew that if the truth ever needed to stand on its own, without emotional context, without deference, it would need a record. So I kept one, quietly, consistently, without malice. And all the while, they continued to believe I was just listening. The private reveal didn't arrive with adrenaline. There was no rush of triumph, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It came quietly, the way most real confirmations do, through accumulation. By then, I had months of notes. Not dramatic entries, just lines, dates, repeated phrases, variations in explanation. Small contradictions that didn't matter individually, but formed a shape when placed side by side. I hadn't been looking for leverage. That's important. I wasn't hunting for a flaw to exploit or a weakness to expose. I was trying to understand whether what I'd heard at that dinner was an exception or a key. It turned out to be a key. The realization came one evening as I was reviewing my notes, not because I felt compelled to, but because it had become routine. I was cross-checking timelines, something he'd said privately, against something he'd stated later, in a more formal context. The contradiction wasn't explosive. It was clean. In one version, he acknowledged initiating a decision. In another, he described responding to circumstances beyond his control. Same event, same outcome, different agency. That difference mattered. Not morally, at least not yet, but structurally. Because once you see where agency disappears, you understand where accountability is being quietly redirected. I sat with that realization longer than I expected, not because I was conflicted, but because I was recalibrating how serious this actually was. Families misremember things all the time. People reshape stories unconsciously. I needed to be sure I wasn't inflating normal human behavior into something else. So I tested it, not by confronting him, but by listening more closely. I asked for clarification later, casually. I referenced the event without framing it as a challenge. I let him explain it again. This time, the language shifted further. Another layer of distance appeared between him and the decision. Another softening. Another justification is framed as inevitability. It wasn't accidental. That was the moment of clarity. Not outrage, not betrayal. Clarity. I understood then that what he had admitted privately was not something he could, or would, stand behind publicly, if standing behind it came with consequences. The truth, in his mind, was flexible, contextual, dependent on the audience. And I understood something else. He believed no one would ever place those versions side by side. Because who would? Family loyalty discourages documentation. Love encourages forgetting. Silence protects continuity. I had broken one of those conditions simply by paying attention. The private reveal wasn't just about him. It was about the role I had played in making this possible. My quiet presence had created a sense of safety. He had spoken freely because he believed I would absorb the information the way I absorbed everything else. And for a long time I had. But absorption is not the same as erasure. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. Because once you know the truth has multiple versions, you stop arguing about which one is correct. You start asking which one will survive scrutiny. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't write anything new. I didn't need to. The picture was complete enough. What I had wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense. It wasn't something hidden behind locked doors. It was something offered casually, then quietly revised. That distinction matters. Secrets imply shame. This was a strategy. I also realized that whatever came next would need to be handled with precision. Not emotion, not exposure, precision. Because the moment this crossed into a formal space, where statements are recorded, compared, preserved, the gap between versions would no longer be abstract. It would be measurable. And once something is measurable, it becomes real in a way confidence can't override. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. Not friends, not family, not even myself fully. I didn't narrate it as a turning point. I just adjusted my posture internally. From that point on, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. I stopped questioning my memory. I stopped minimizing the significance of what I'd heard. I trusted myself. That trust didn't make me reckless. It made me patient, because clarity doesn't demand immediate action. It demands restraint until action actually matters. And I knew quietly, unmistakably, that it would. The decision point wasn't dramatic. There was no ultimatum, no countdown, no moment where I felt forced into action. What existed instead was a narrowing of options, a gradual understanding that some paths, once seen clearly, can't be unseen. The catalyst came not from my family, but from outside it. A formal inquiry began, quietly at first. Paperwork, requests for clarification, nothing accusatory, just process. The kind of process that doesn't care about family dynamics or personal history, only about records, timelines, consistency. I wasn't surprised. I'd sensed this direction for a while. Systems tend to notice what people ignore. When my father told me about it, he did so casually, almost dismissively. He framed it as a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic inconvenience, something that would resolve itself once everyone had the full picture. As he spoke, I recognized the language. It was the public version already taking shape. He didn't ask me for help. He didn't ask what I remembered. He assumed, correctly, based on history, that I would remain in my usual role, quiet, supportive, uncomplicating. That assumption placed the decision squarely in front of me. I could stay where I was, say nothing, let the process unfold without my involvement. No one was asking me to lie. Silence would be easy to justify. Familial loyalty is a powerful shield. Or I could step into a different position, one that didn't require confrontation, but did require accuracy. The weight of that choice surprised me, not because I felt torn between right and wrong, but because both options carried consequences that couldn't be undone. If I stayed silent, I would be preserving the relationship as it existed, or at least the appearance of it. I would also be allowing a version of events to stand that I knew was incomplete. That omission would belong to me. If I spoke, carefully, factually, I would be introducing friction into a system that relied on my compliance. I wouldn't be accusing, I wouldn't be editorializing, but I would be changing the conditions under which the narrative operated. I spent days sitting with that. I didn't consult anyone. I didn't ask for advice. Not because I didn't trust others, but because this decision wasn't about strategy. It was about alignment. I asked myself one question over and over, stripping it down until there was nothing abstract left. Who do I become if I do nothing? The answer wasn't flattering. It wasn't dramatic either. It was quiet and specific. I would become someone who knew the difference between private truth and public record, and chose convenience over coherence. That realization settled the question. I didn't decide to go against my father. I decided to stop protecting a version of events that depended on my silence. That distinction mattered to me. When I was formally contacted, I responded with the same tone I used for everything else. Calm, precise, limited to what I directly knew. I didn't speculate. I didn't interpret motives. I answered questions as they were asked. I provided dates, context, exact phrasing where I could remember it. I made it clear what I had witnessed, and just as clear what I hadn't. No embellishment, no framing, just consistency. I didn't tell my father beforehand, not out of malice, but because the decision wasn't negotiable. Once I'd chosen accuracy, there was nothing to discuss. That was the irreversible part, because once truth enters a formal record, it no longer belongs to the relationship. It belongs to the process. I understood then why so many people avoid this moment, why silence is so seductive. Because action doesn't just change outcomes, it changes how you're perceived forever. I didn't know how my father would respond. I didn't know how the family would adjust. I didn't know what consequences would follow. But I knew this: I would recognize myself on the other side of the decision, and that quietly was enough. Once the decision was made, everything became very quiet. Not externally. Life continued as usual. Family conversations resumed their familiar rhythms. Text messages arrived about logistics and plans. On the surface, nothing suggested that the ground had shifted, but internally, I had stepped into a different tempo. I didn't announce what I'd done. I didn't hint. I didn't prepare anyone. There was no benefit in telegraphing a change that was already in motion. Processes like this don't require noise. They require patience. The inquiry moved forward slowly, the way formal systems always do. Requests came in measured intervals. Clarifications followed clarifications. Timelines were examined, then re-examined. I responded when asked, only when asked. Each response was precise, bounded, documented. I didn't volunteer information beyond the scope of the question. I didn't contextualize emotionally. I treated the process the way I treated my work, respectfully, but without deference. That approach mattered. Silence, when paired with accuracy, unsettles people who are used to managing perception. There was no reaction for anyone to anticipate, no emotional cue to calibrate against, just facts entering a record one at a time. My father began to sense the shift before he could name it. I noticed it in the way he spoke around me, more careful, but not yet suspicious. He started with qualifying statements, adding disclaimers, checking phrasing mid-sentence. Still, he didn't ask me directly what I'd said. That told me everything. He assumed, as he always had, that I would stay within my role, that my silence meant alignment, that if something were wrong, I would signal it emotionally before acting. He didn't understand that I had already acted, and that the silence he was reading as safety was actually distance. The family, too, felt something without knowing what. Plans became tentative, conversations less fluid. There was a subtle sense of recalibration happening, like furniture being moved in another room. No one confronted me. There was nothing to confront. That was the power of moving quietly. Nothing escalated because nothing was visible yet. I was careful not to change my behavior in ways that would invite suspicion. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold. I didn't offer commentary on the process. I remained consistent. Consistency is disarming when others are adjusting. There were moments when I felt the weight of what was coming, not as fear, but as gravity. Once set in motion, systems don't stop just because relationships get uncomfortable. I understood that whatever outcome emerged would not feel proportional to the effort I'd expended. Quiet actions often produce outsized consequences because they bypass resistance. I also understood that the hardest part was not the waiting, it was the restraint. The discipline of not correcting assumptions. The discipline of not preparing explanations in advance. The discipline of letting others encounter reality without my mediation. This was the opposite of the role I'd played for years, and yet it felt more aligned than anything I'd done before. I wasn't moving in silence to avoid responsibility. I was moving in silence because responsibility no longer required performance. When the next phase arrived, and it did, inevitably, it didn't arrive with accusations or drama. It arrived with implications. And by then, the narrative no longer belonged to any one person. It belonged to the record. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when they're real. They came in fragments, small disruptions that were easy to misinterpret at first. A delayed response, a meeting that didn't go as expected, a request for clarification that felt unnecessary, even insulting. My father mentioned these things in passing, the way people do when they're still confident the situation is manageable. He framed them as annoyances, administrative overreach, technicalities that would be resolved once the right people reviewed the information. But beneath that tone, something else had begun to surface. Uncertainty. I could hear it in the way he spoke, sentences that circled instead of landing, explanations that felt slightly rehearsed. The casual authority he once carried had softened at the edges. Not collapsed, softened. At first, the family interpreted this as stress. They offered reassurance. They filled in gaps with optimism. These things always take time. It'll sort itself out. You've done nothing wrong. They weren't lying. They were participating. I watched this from my familiar position on the periphery, the stabilizer's chair, the one where reactions are expected to be measured and support is assumed, and I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't confirm or deny anyone's assumptions. I didn't adjust their expectations. I didn't offer comfort beyond what was appropriate. I let them process in the way that felt safest to them. That restraint mattered more than I realized at the time. As the process continued, the questions became more pointed, not accusatory, but specific. Requests for documentation, requests for consistency, requests that required answers to line up with prior statements. That's when the real discomfort began, because confidence can carry you through ambiguity, but it falters under comparison. My father began to revisit old conversations aloud, trying to reconstruct timelines. He spoke as if thinking through them in real time, but I recognized the effort underneath. He was testing versions, looking for one that held. Sometimes he glanced at me when he did this, just briefly, as if checking whether I remembered things the same way. I didn't respond, not because I was withholding, because there was nothing to add. The family started to feel the strain, not from me, but from the lack of clarity. Plans became tentative. The atmosphere grew cautious. Conversations that once flowed easily now hesitated at certain topics. People could feel something slipping, even if they didn't know what. Loss is often sensed before it's understood. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when I realized the consequences were no longer abstract. A family member mentioned a change in circumstances, casually, as if it were temporary. A shift in expectations, a door that had quietly closed. No one reacted strongly. They adjusted. And in that adjustment, I felt the weight of finality. Not satisfied, not guilt. Finality, because once systems respond, they don't care about intent. They care about alignment, about whether words and records tell the same story. By then, my father had stopped narrating confidently. He spoke less. When he did speak, he hedged. The certainty that once anchored the room was gone. No one said it out loud, but the dynamic had changed. Authority was no longer assumed. And because authority had been the foundation of so many unspoken agreements, its absence rippled outward. People felt unmoored. They searched for explanations that didn't require re-examining the past. Some found them, others didn't. I remained steady, not because I was unaffected, but because reacting now would have shifted the focus away from what mattered. This wasn't about my feelings. It was about consequences unfolding according to their own logic. I had stopped being the stabilizer. Now the system was stabilizing itself, and it was doing so without consulting anyone. By the time panic appeared, it was already too late to be useful. It didn't arrive as hysteria. It arrived as urgency disguised as reason. A sudden need to clarify things, a desire to get ahead of misunderstandings, conversations that circled back to the same events, the same decisions, the same carefully edited explanations. My father began to speak in hypotheticals, if it's interpreted that way. Looking back, maybe I should have phrased it differently. I assumed everyone understood the context. These weren't admissions, they were adjustments, last-minute attempts to reframe without fully rewriting. He was trying to correct the trajectory without acknowledging the deviation. That works in personal relationships. It doesn't work once the record exists. I could feel his anxiety, not because he said he was worried, but because he couldn't stop revisiting the past aloud. He was searching for a version of events that felt safer, cleaner, more defensible. The problem was simple. The system wasn't listening to how things felt. It was listening to what had been said, when, and to whom. And those things are no longer aligned. The family reacted in stages. First, with reassurance, then with confusion, then with frustration. They wanted resolution, not because they understood the implications, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable. They asked questions I couldn't answer without saying more than I was willing to say. What's actually going on? Why is this taking so long? Is there something we don't know? I responded carefully. I didn't lie. I didn't disclose. I simply stayed within the boundaries I'd set from the beginning. I don't have more information. It's being handled through the proper channels. I don't think speculation helps. Some of them read that as detachment, others as avoidance. Neither was accurate. I was staying aligned. My father eventually tried a different approach, not confrontation, appeal. He spoke about family, about loyalty, about how things can be misunderstood when they're taken out of context. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. This didn't have to go where it was going. I listened, calmly, fully. And then I did something that surprised even me. Nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't reassure. I didn't promise anything would be okay. Because at that point, nothing I said could alter the outcome without altering the truth. That's the moment most people break. The moment when discomfort tempts you to intervene, to smooth things over, to offer emotional relief, to try to repair something that no longer belongs to you. I felt that temptation, but I also felt something steadier beneath it, acceptance. The process had moved beyond personalities, beyond intentions, beyond the need for explanation. It wasn't punishing anyone. It was simply responding. And response, unlike revenge, doesn't require anger. There were visible losses by then, opportunities that quietly disappeared, assumptions that no longer hold. The family adjusted again, this time with less optimism and more resignation. They didn't connect these changes to me, not directly. That too was too late, because the truth was already doing what truth does when it's no longer managed. It was standing on its own. My father grew quieter, not reflective, contained. He stopped revisiting old stories, stopped testing versions. The energy shifted from correction to endurance. The system had spoken, and systems don't negotiate. I realized then that closure doesn't come with clarity for everyone involved. Some people never fully understand what happened. They just feel the after effects and move on. That's not cruelty, it's reality. For the first time, I felt the full distance between who I had been in the family and who I was now. Not exiled, not elevated, just no longer positioned as a buffer. And once that role is gone, there's no going back to it. Not because you refuse, but because the system has adapted to your absence. The moment to fix it had passed. Not because I withheld something, but because the truth once recorded doesn't require maintenance. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, no moment where everything spilled out at once. It happened in a quiet room, on an ordinary afternoon, without an audience. My father asked if we could talk. That was all. I noticed how carefully he chose the setting. Neutral, private, no one else around to witness or interpret. He didn't sit across from me like an opponent. He sat beside me, angled slightly away, as if positioning himself for conversation rather than conflict. He began by saying he felt something had changed between us. Not accusingly, observationally. I don't know when, he said, but I can feel it. I let the silence stretch before responding. Not to unsettle him, but because I wanted to be sure I spoke from clarity, not reflex. I told him the truth without commentary. That I had listened carefully when he spoke at that dinner. I had noticed the difference between how things were described privately and how they appeared later. That was when I was asked to provide information, and I answered honestly. I didn't use words like betrayal or manipulation. I didn't frame it as a moral failure. I didn't list consequences. I kept it factual. He listened without interrupting. That alone told me how serious the situation had become. He asked a few questions, not defensive ones, but probing. He wanted to know what I remembered, how certain I was, whether I understood the pressure he'd been under. I answered the first two. I declined the third. I'm not evaluating your reasons, I said. I'm explaining my position. There was a long pause after that, not tense, heavy. He said he wished I'd come to him first. I told him I understood why he would feel that way. I didn't apologize. That seemed to land harder than anything else I said. He asked quietly whether I thought he was a bad person. The question surprised me, not because it was manipulative, but because it revealed something I hadn't considered. This wasn't about the outcome anymore. It was about identity. I answered carefully. I think people can make choices they don't want to stand behind later, I said, and I think pretending otherwise costs more than facing it. He nodded slowly. There was no resolution in that conversation. No forgiveness requested. No absolution offered. Just an acknowledgement that something irreversible had passed between us. When it ended, we didn't embrace. We didn't argue. We simply stood, exchanged a few neutral words, and went our separate ways. I felt no rush of relief afterward, no triumph, just a quiet settling. Because confrontation doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just brings alignment. I hadn't spoken to be understood. I'd spoken to be accurate. And accuracy, I was learning, doesn't need agreement to stand. That was the last time we spoke about it directly. What surprised me most afterward was how little bitterness I felt. I had expected something sharper, anger, grief, maybe even a sense of loss I couldn't name. Instead, what settled in was clarity. Not the kind that feels victorious, but the kind that feels spacious. Without the stabilizer role, I had more internal room than I knew what to do with at first. For years, a portion of my attention had been dedicated to monitoring tone, smoothing transitions, and anticipating reactions. When that responsibility disappeared, it left a quiet vacuum. I noticed how often I used to brace myself without realizing it. How much energy had gone into maintaining an equilibrium that wasn't mine to maintain. Now my calm felt different. It wasn't performative, it wasn't strategic, it was simply mine. My relationship with my father didn't end. It changed shape. We speak less often. When we do, the conversations stay on the surface. Logistics, neutral observations, shared history that doesn't require interpretation. There's no hostility in that, just boundaries. I no longer carry the impulse to make him comfortable. I don't manage his self-concept. I don't absorb his uncertainty. That work belongs to him now. The family adjusted, as families do. Some relationships grew quieter. Others grew unexpectedly honest. Without the old roles in place, people had to renegotiate how they related to me. A few tried to pull me back into familiar patterns, to hint that things would feel better if I were more flexible, more reassuring, more like I used to be. I didn't argue with them. I simply didn't comply. What I've learned since is that quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-definition. It's about no longer allowing other people's comfort to dictate your relationship with the truth. I don't explain myself as much anymore. I don't preemptively soften statements. I don't rush to fill the silence. I let things land. At work, this has translated into clarity. I'm more direct, not louder, just more precise. I trust my memory. I trust my perception. I document without apology. In my personal life, it's translated into discernment. I pay attention to who requires me to disappear in order to stay comfortable. And I don't stay where that's the price of admission. I don't regret the choices I made, not because the outcome was favorable. It wasn't for everyone, but because I can live inside the person I became through them. Integrity, I've learned, isn't about moral purity. It's about coherence, about making sure your private understanding and your public actions don't require constant translation. I still value peace. I still value empathy. I still choose restraint more often than confrontation. But my restraint is no longer automatic. It's informed. And that difference has changed everything. I'm no longer underestimated in the way I once was. Not because others see me differently, but because I no longer rely on being seen at all. The quiet I carry now isn't absence. It's presence without performance. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a lesson that feels clean. Something definitive, a warning, a rule you can apply to every situation. I don't have that. What I have instead is a quieter understanding, one that took me a long time to accept. Truth doesn't always need to be defended to be real. Sometimes it just needs to be preserved long enough to matter. For years, I believed that keeping the peace was a moral good, that being calm was the same as being kind, that loyalty meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. Those beliefs weren't wrong, but they were incomplete. What I learned is that peace built on selective memory is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It asks certain people to shrink so others can remain unchallenged, and shrinking over time has a cost. I didn't speak up because I wanted to hurt my father. I didn't document because I wanted leverage. I didn't stay silent because I was afraid. I did what I did because I wanted my inner world and my outward actions to match. That's the part people don't always talk about, the quiet exhaustion of living with a split narrative, of knowing one version of events privately while participating in another publicly, of sensing that something is off, but telling yourself it's not worth naming. It is worth naming, not loudly, not dramatically, but accurately. Justice doesn't always look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like refusing to edit yourself so someone else can remain comfortable. Sometimes it looks like allowing systems, not emotions, to respond. Sometimes it looks like letting consequences unfold without adding commentary or cruelty. I didn't come out of this feeling superior. I came out feeling lighter, Because once you stop managing other people's relationship with the truth, you get your energy back. Once you stop buffering reality, you get to stand inside it. And from that position, something surprising happens. You become harder to manipulate, not because you're aggressive, but because you're consistent. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about coherence. It's about choosing to be someone whose memory doesn't bend under pressure, whose calm doesn't depend on denial, and whose silence is a choice, not a reflex. If you take anything from this story, I hope it's this. You don't owe anyone your disappearance. You don't owe anyone your amnesia. And you don't owe anyone silence that costs you your sense of self. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remember. And then, when the moment comes, tell the truth without heat. I'll end by asking you something, not to judge, but to reflect. Have you ever been in a situation where staying quiet felt like peace, but remembering felt like integrity? If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear how you handled it.